All right, welcome back. This is lesson 2 of the Next Step series. I'm going to go through a little bit of review of what we covered in video 1 for anybody that might be jumping into this that hasn't gone through and watched again. I'm going to try to structure these videos in a sequential order. That way you can kind of build off of each lesson as we go on one to the other. So in the first lesson, we talked about the importance of being able to play each chord, major and minor, going up the piano, and that's a form of initial practice. That's the very first foundational building block, is to be able to know if anybody said play a B major chord, play a B major. If someone said play an E minor chord, play an E minor chord. And then we went through scales and the importance of scales. And in scales, that really opens up the entire keyboard and it maps out what steps you need to take. No one likes to hit a wrong note. So if you're playing in the key of E major and that's a wrong note. Now, there might be a need for that note if you're looking for a particular sound or a particular voicing. There's a lot of complex chords out there, but in the typical key of E major, a G does not fit in there. It would need to be a G flat or a G sharp or A flat, depending on how you actually reference this. So the importance of knowing each scale, at least the major scales, in every single note that you're relating it to. And then we talked about inversions. And inversions are, instead of just taking like a root C and your first note in playing that chord is the C note, and then you stack an E and stack a G, that's a root C chord. And a first inversion is going to, instead of having the C on the bottom, you're going to have the E on the bottom. And then you have to replace the C somewhere, so you find after you've done the E and the G, you find the next spot that the C comes in. It's right there. So that's a first inversion, and you'd carry that theory on for a second inversion. You make the G, which is normally the third note of the chord, of the triad. That's now the bottom. And then C is your next one in that chord. And then E, and that is your second inversion. And how inversions play into what we are trying to do in music is they can help us make things either sound more uniform or more spread out. And something we didn't talk about in the first video is the sustain pedal. So it's also called the damper pedal. A lot of times if you're playing on a digital keyboard like this one, there's only one pedal, and I'll try to reach down here and show you what this looks like. Looks like this. So the importance of the sustain pedal is that it allows you to hold out a note. If I just press on a C without pressing the pedal down and then let go, the note stops. If I hold the sustain pedal, it carries the note out, and it slowly tapers off and dies down. So if I'm doing a broken chord where I'm playing multiple notes in a chord, as soon as I let my fingers off with no sustain pedal, it dies. But if you're playing maybe the end of a song and you're trying to kind of smooth it out, land the plane, if you hold the sustain pedal down, then it's going to carry that tone out. So playing inversions can kind of help you with that, especially if you're doing something with the low end and a very high end, because it's going to carry all of that at once and allow you, while you sustain this out, to just kind of keep going with it, and it carries all the tones. So damper pedal, we'll have more videos that show the technique of how to actually use that damper and sustain pedal to your advantage in changing chords. But I want to just keep on going with this so we don't take up too much time on the video. The other thing that we covered is the octaves. And how octaves can add a little more emphasis to a note because you're literally doubling up with either an octave higher or an octave lower. And especially on low tones, I talked about how that is a technique that 90% of the time I use just an octave as my low end on the keys. So now, getting into lesson 2, this is going to be about ear training. And I have kind of honed in my skill through the years of playing by ear. I rarely use music anymore. It kind of just gets in the way, and it distracts me from doing what I feel like it distracts me from the artwork of playing the instrument. So I rarely even look at it when I'm rehearsing, because my ear can hear the chord changes when I'm just listening to a song. So if at our church we have a new song that we're about to play, I rarely will look at the chord charts on it. I will just listen to the song, and once I've heard the song once, maybe twice, I know where those chord changes are at, and then they're just stuck in my memory. So I don't recommend, unless you're really honed in with that skill, to do that, but that's something you can work towards, and I think that it is possible to develop that skill. You don't have to be born with it. So being able to hear the relation of chord changes and what they sound like, and that's what we're going to get into right now. So again, C is the most neutral key, so let's go ahead and work it out of the key of C. Now, before we get into the relation of chords to each other, the important thing with honing your ear and to be able to pick up sounds and play by ear and just kind of go off of the keys instead of the sheet music is to hear the difference between a major and a minor chord. So a C major chord, it's a happy sound. It's a joyful chord. It's got all of the tones to make a song have an upbeat and positive feel. And I mentioned the word dirge in the last video. A dirge is kind of like a funeral song, or a very melancholy, a lot of classical music is written in minor keys, and minor sounding chords sound sad, or some people have called them more serious sounding chords. So a major chord is a very happy sounding chord. So in the key of C, we've got a C major and a C minor, and you should be able to hear that difference. Happy, joyful, positive, a little more sad, a little more serious. Okay? And then it doesn't matter which chord you're playing. This goes back to even before the first lesson when I talked about be able to play every major and minor chord. Well, this is where this starts to fit in. So A major chord, A minor chord. And a way that you can start to develop this skill is to have somebody with you that also knows how to play keys, and have them play a chord and just test yourself. And when you hear this chord, just, is it major or minor? It's a minor, because of the feeling that it gives, the tone that it gives, as opposed to, now that's a compound chord, but it's not, it's kind of a branch off of a major. So that's a B flat major chord, and you can hear it's happy, sad. That's a minor chord, that's sad, happy, major. So by being able to pick out a major and a minor, you already can tell. Doesn't matter which key you're in. If I hear a song and it's the first chord is an A minor, I know that I can pick up that it's a minor, and from there everything else starts to paint a picture. I can kind of start to see what colors they're painting with, and within, for me right now, within the first 1 to 2 chords of a song, I can tell you what chords are likely to be used in that song, what order they're likely to be used in, repeating structures, and that's what we're going to get into. Hopefully I can make this this lesson on ear training just a one video. I don't want it to be too long, so I might have to break this up into two parts. So we first start with knowing the difference between a major and a minor chord, what they sound like. And this is something that will take time. It's just something that you get a little bit better at. It's like sharpening a tool or learning how to write or learning how to speak a different language, is hearing what that difference sounds like. Okay? So now I want to get into how chords sound in relation to each other. So carrying that same thing, knowing what a major and a minor sound like. When we're in the key of C, we name each note in the scale off of a number. So you might have heard people say, we're going to go to the 4 chord, the 5 chord, and then the relative minor. And that's just speaking a different language, but everything is made off of a number. So if C, you're in the key of C, that would mean C is your starting note, 1. D would be 2, and so on. 3 E, 4 F, 5 G, 6 A, and 7 B. And then if you go to the top, you're just at 1 again. This just repeats because every C represents the letter 1, or the number 1, every letter C. So when you're talking about common chord progressions, a lot of songs, starting from the 1950s all the way up to now, like 50s music was a lot of that's repeating 4 chords over again. The 1, C, the relative minor, which is technically a 6 minor, the 4, which would happen to be an F, and then the G, which is a 5. And now a lot of worship music follows a minor 6 pattern, 4, 1, and then 5. And there's a lot of different variations of these, but that is something that you just start to see patterns forming. And the difference in understanding what the relation is between a 1 and a 4, or a 1 and a 5, that's training your ear to hear that in a song, okay? So let's take the song Amazing Grace, all right? In the key of C. We start on the root, C. Amazing grace, how sweet. Now, if you're singing this in your head, a lot of you might be able to hear where that next chord should be. You may not know what it is, but you should hear where that chord should be, all right? Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. So that goes to the 4 because we're naming it 1, 2, 3, 4. So in the key of C, the 4 is an F chord. And it kind of has this lift. It's still a happy chord, and it just kind of lifts you up. Even if you're going from a C here to an F below, in a lower tone, it still lifts the song a little bit. And a lot of you may have heard of the Hallelujah chorus. It's been covered in the secular realm, Christian. Lincoln Brewster covered it. There's a lot of great versions, and it's used a lot at Christmas time. And there are lyrics in there that actually point out to the musical language that references number system. So I heard there was a sacred chord that David played and it pleased the Lord. And then right here, so we're in the root, it goes like this, the 4th. So they're playing the 4 chord, the F. The 5th, that's the G, that's actually the 5 chord. The minor fall, that's the A minor, and that's the relative minor. And it almost feels like it's falling into a sad spot. So the minor fall and the major lift. So the major lift is that major initial lifting tone you get out of that 4 chord. So that whole verse section is actually referencing a musical number system. And in hearing the relation to what this sounds like, this is a 1 to a 4. And using an inversion to make it more compact so that it's easier on your ears. Kind of sounds a lot like Lean on Me, right? Sometimes in our lives, we all have pain. So that's the sound of a 1 and a 4 together. Now a 1 and a 5, that's a very straight tone. There are things called power chords. If you're using guitars with distortion and you're just kind of chunking along, a lot of 90 songs had it this way, 80 songs. It kind of sounds strange. I hope there's no one that gets offended by me saying this, but I refer to it as an asexual chord, meaning that there's like no gender to it. So if you would have a gender, let's just say that a major was a male and a minor was a female. Okay? When you have a 1 and a 5, there's no major or minors in that. There can't be. So it's just a straight chord. It's an asexual chord. There's no gender any way with it. So you can, if you're ever confused and you see a chord marking and you're not sure if it's actually correct that it's a major or minor, you can literally play just the 1 and the 5, and you will blend in with most of that chord, and someone else might be playing the major or the minor. So the relation with a 1 and a 5, so a lot of songs will end or even begin on a 5 that are upbeat. 60s songs did this a lot, 50s and 60s songs. So really kind of, my son listens to the Wiggles a lot, and they do songs in that style a lot, so there's a lot of that pivoting on that 5 chord. So covering again, we've got the root, the 4, so the 1 and the 4, 1, 5. And you can kind of start to hear what those sound like, what the relationship of those sound like. Now, if you're thinking about a relative minor or a minor fall, a 6 minor, because this is, even though we're going down, if you're counting down, you're coming down 3 steps there, it's still the 6 in the scale because there's another C that's down here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's your A. That's your relative minor in the key of C. And the reason why they say that is that the minor scale of an A minor hits all the exact same notes of a major scale in the key of C. It's just where you are actually coming in at it. You're coming in at a different point. And it's kind of an auditory illusion. And that actually branches into what you would call modes. I believe that a relative minor scale is considered an Aeolian mode, I think. There's Dorian mode, Mixolydian, and Phrygian, and all these different modes. And they're just classifying different parts of where a scale will come in referencing another one. And that's very, very complicated, and I might cover that in later lessons, but not important right now. What is important is memorizing the sounds of what a 1 and a 4 sound like, what a 1 and a 5 sound like, what a 1 and a relative minor sound like. So that same Hallelujah chorus that I was singing, I heard there was a sacred chord that David played and it pleased the Lord. That's going back and forth between the root and the relative minor. You don't really care for music, do ya? So it's covering a lot of the common chords that are in songs. A 1, a 4, a 5, and a relative minor. Now, there are many different chords that you can use in a regular scale, but if you wanted to get exact and precise about how do you tell if it's going to be a major or a minor chord when you go from a 1 to a 4, there is a system for that. So in a typical scale, you start on a 1 as a major, you start on a 2 as a minor, a 3 would be minor, a 4 would be major, a 5 would be major, a 6 would be minor, and then a 7 is technically diminished, and then you're back to the root again on a, you know, the 8 or the 1, which are the same thing, the C. So that's the general rule. Now that can obviously change up if you're going to a 2 from the root of 1. We start in C, so that's number 1. That's the root. You don't have to, anytime you hit the 2, which is a D minor, you don't always have to play the minor. Some songs, there's some bands in the 90s I remember that did this a lot. They're singing in the root, and then the next chord, they're playing a dominant, which is a form of a major chord on a 2, and then the resolve on the 4, and then kind of carry on from a chorus from there. So rules can be broken and manipulated, but in general, that's kind of how it goes. So it's major, minor, minor, major, major, minor. You could say minor. It's really more diminished, and then major again for the root. Major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, minor or diminished, and root. 1 again. So I think this is probably a good point to go ahead and break this up into a second video. I don't want to rush this, and even though future videos will expound more on this topic of training your ear and listening for it, I don't want to rush the basics and the foundations and the concepts. So I think I'm going to break it off for right now, and then we'll jump into part 2 of this, of ear training, in the next video. So stay tuned.